The Good Samaritan is one of those stories that a lot of people think they know, but upon investigation, there's actually a deeper meaning that's basically hidden. The Good Samaritan was a story Jesus told to make a point. You can read it in Luke chapter 10, and nobody really knows if the story was made up or something Jesus just used as an illustration, or if he was telling a story that literally happened. But the only way to really see the point Jesus was trying to make is to do a little bit of research on the characters Jesus put in the story and some background research on the people Jesus was telling the story to. Jesus told this story to a Jewish lawyer who basically came up to him and he asked him, "Hey, how can I get into heaven?" And Jesus says, "Well, what does the law say? How do you read it?" Now, he wasn't talking about the government's law. He was talking about the Jewish law that came from the Bible, specifically Leviticus chapter 19, which says, "Love your neighbor." So Jesus is asking him, well, how do you interpret this verse? I wonder why Jesus would ask that. To answer the question of who qualifies as my neighbor, Jesus tells this story. And the basic story goes like this. There's a Jewish man traveling, and he's traveling on a road that probably looks something like this. On that road, he was attacked by robbers. They leave him half dead, naked, in a ditch. And people start to walk by. The first person who walks by is a priest. And he walks on by like he doesn't even see the dying man, which would be shocking. So that's the first offensive thing that Jesus said. It was pretty brave of Jesus to paint a Jewish priest in such a negative light when he's talking to Jews. It kind of challenges the idea that, if somebody knows the Bible, they must be a good person, right? Well, here he's challenging the understanding, saying, hey, just because you are religious, it doesn't mean you really understand what the Bible is trying to say. A second guy walks by. He's a Levite. You're probably wondering, what the heck is a Levite? It was basically somebody who helped with their worship service in the temple. So Levites were musicians, craftsmen, they stood at the door, things like that. They were there to help people. So it's interesting that this Levite walks by and he doesn't help the dying man either. I mean, the Levite, that's exactly the person that you would expect to help someone in a ditch who's dying. But he walks on by. Then there's a third character who walks by, a Samaritan. Now this is where it gets interesting because you have to do a little bit of research on who Samaritans were in relation to the Jews to really get the point that Jesus is trying to make. Jews and Samaritans had a rivalry going. They hated each other. So it was pretty provocative for Jesus to tell this story about a Samaritan to the Jews. Samaritans were a subset of Jews. So you might think of them like Methodists or Baptists are under the Christian umbrella. Samaritans and Jews are basically spiritual brothers. But they had a disagreement. Both of these groups wanted to rebuild the Jewish temple, but they had a disagreement on where that temple should be built. It really came down to an interpretation problem about where God had said the temple should be in the Old Testament. So the Samaritans thought that God told them to build the temple on Mount Gerizim, while the Jews thought God had told them to build the temple on Mount Zion. They had different interpretations of the same passage that caused a rivalry. So they both built temples, and they both claimed that their temple was the real temple, while the other temple was a fraud. So you can see how this would probably cause some animosity. This fighting between the Jews and Samaritans went on for years and years, and it got really heated. Basically ended up in a bunch of discrimination. So when Jesus tells this story, he makes the Samaritan the hero of the story and tells this story to the Jews. The Samaritan comes along, sees the dying man in a ditch, and he goes over there and he bandages him up, puts wine and oil on the man's wounds, and he pays for the man to stay in a hotel for 2 nights. Then he basically tells the hotel manager, hey, if this guy needs to stay here longer, just put it on my tab. I'll come back and I'll pay the rest later. I wish I could see what the Jewish lawyer's response to the story was, because I can't imagine he was very happy. He probably did not like the story very well. Today, people read this story and they kind of simplify it and think it's just telling us that we need to help people. But it's really going a layer deeper than that. It's saying, hey, when you see your enemy hurting at the side of the road or in trouble, you've got to help your enemy. That's what love your neighbor means. So that's the kind of revolution that Jesus was trying to lead. Unfortunately, people today still have trouble understanding that. I think everybody struggles with this to some extent. If you back up 1 chapter in the Bible to Luke chapter 9, even Jesus' inner circle was struggling with this idea. There's a story there where they're trying to find a hotel or place to stay in a Samaritan village. But the Samaritans don't want to give them a place to stay because they were Jewish. So a couple of Jesus' followers get ticked off and they say, hey, can we call down fire from heaven to burn this place down? And Jesus is like, no, and he has to chew them out. I think the takeaway here is to think about, if Jesus were telling the story today, who would he put in the position of the Samaritan? Who would he make the unexpected hero of the story? I like this story because it challenges black and white thinking. It challenges the idea that people can be categorized as either good or bad, hero or villain. It makes people rethink that. But it also shows that Jesus defined neighbor as your enemy. Like whoever our enemy is today, that person qualifies as our neighbor when he says, love your neighbor. So who is your neighbor? You might not like the answer to that very well. It might be someone from an opposing political party or religion or denomination. It's a really tough teaching, but if you really think about it, it's a really good teaching.